Hello everyone, this is an introductory Photoshop tutorial where I will talk about the basics in Photoshop and how my workspace is typically set up. So when I open Photoshop, I will normally see a slightly different screen than this, so I'm going to just create a new file. So if I go File, New, it opens this new document window. So if you're starting Photoshop for the first time, you can select to create a new document and this window will pop up. Important things to note. On this side, I normally work in inches. That way I know exactly how big my file is and inches that will be printed on a sheet of paper. So I'm going to be working on 11 by 17. So I'm going to set the width to 17, the height to 11. If you wanted to do a portrait format, you could do that and flip that, right? So it could be 11 inches wide by 17 tall. Under resolution, because I'm going to print, I'm going to select 300. You can get by with something slightly smaller than that, technically for printing, but normally 300 is a good benchmark for when you're printing high resolution images. Like this will be 200 is sort of the minimum I would recommend for printing. If you're doing something on a screen, the resolution can be smaller. Normally 150 is recommended for screen. So 300 if you're printing. You can always view 300 on a screen as well. So 300, your file size will be bigger the larger you make this number and the larger you make the inches number. And then up here I'm going to give my file a name, so I'm just going to do Surreal Photoshop. Surreal Collage. Okay. And then to turn my rulers on, you hit Command R. To get this window set up as I have it, if you go Window, Workspace, so up at the top there's Window, Workspace, Essentials is probably what's set if you're opening Photoshop for the first time. Just know that there are different options. Painting is one that brings up lots of different windows that are useful. Essentials is probably fine, so I'm going to go Window, Workspace, Essentials, and then just know under Window there are all of these other options of panels that you can open that hold different tools or different elements that you might use in Photoshop. On the left-hand side is my toolbar where similar to Illustrator, I have different tools that I can use over here, like color picking, like there's a cutout tool. We'll talk about some of those more in depth. And then on the right-hand side, there's things that look probably a little familiar to you because they are similar to Illustrator, such as like a layer panel where I can create new layers. You can create a new layer like similar to Illustrator by pressing the new layer square at the bottom. I can delete a layer if I have it selected by hitting the trash can. It asks me if I want to delete it. Click yes. Photoshop works similarly to Illustrator in that anything that's higher on the layer list will show up on top of other things that are lower than it on the list. So if I have something on this layer 2 and it's above my layer 1, whatever is on layer 2, I guess I can make that more clear, but whatever is on layer, let's do layer 3, it'll show up on top. So the higher on the list, the higher on the actual drawing itself. So if I move layer 3, slide that down, I can move things around by clicking and dragging and releasing. Then suddenly my layer 3, which is the blue line, goes on top of the green line and vice versa. You can turn layers on and off by clicking the little eyeball. You can lock layers by clicking the little lock button. So that means I can't draw on that layer and it'll tell you that. And then I can't also accidentally move something or delete something on that layer. To unlock, you just click the unlock button. Up here, you can also play around with different sort of filters for layers, as well as the opacity of a layer. So if I wanted to make something more transparent, I could adjust it by layer up here. You can also adjust like how the layer reacts to the layers below it. So for example, if I have layer 4 selected, normal just means it'll look normal. If I change it to something, I think one good one is multiply. What that does is it takes everything below it and it multiplies it or blends it all together. So that blue and the green and the gray kind of all blend together, and you can see like that darker spot. It looks almost black. There's a couple other ones like soft light will typically lighten it, so you can kind of see that that green has lightened, but it's also lightened the color or the layers below it. There's a couple different other ones that I think are pretty useful. Screen could be good. It's similar to lighten, except it like takes the color and like almost blocks it out or screens it out or masks it out. So you can play around with adjusting layers based on these options as well. I'm just going to put it back to normal for now. Let's see, on this side are some tools. So this is sort of the marquee tool. Think of it as like a selection tool. So if I have, again, a layer selected, meaning it's highlighted blue, and I can draw by clicking and holding a selection. And if I want, I can like delete that by hitting the delete button. I'm going to hit undo to undo that. But what that's useful for is like selecting, I can copy that area, and then if I hit paste, notice it makes a new layer 5, and it pasted like that chunk of that layer for me there. So there's if you click and hold on any of these tools that have a little triangle, it gives you more options for what's kind of hidden, so it's extra tools. You can select by single lines or by circles. I use the rectangle one most often, I would say. This is the lasso tool, so similar to, it's a selection tool like the marquee tool, but now I can draw by clicking any closed shape, so I have to make a closed shape, like a polygon, and then now that'll make that area of a selection. So if I wanted to trace around this blue line, I could trace around it with the selection tool, and then if I was on that layer, I could copy that and then paste that or edit and manipulate it further. Let's see, there's what's a magnetic lasso tool. So this one works with some success. I don't use it very often, admittedly, but what it does is you can see it starts to trace objects, but the accuracy is sometimes not as great, but it's a kind of a quick way to kind of select around something. It doesn't necessarily work with only one color, so notice as I'm doing it over here, it's kind of lassoing around any object in space. Of course, I could turn off layers if I specifically wanted to trace, for example, this green piece. If you hide all the other layers, then it's only focusing on that. Again, it's like kind of loose and not like the most exact, but useful. And then a lasso tool is just to create like circular, curvilinear shapes. Let's see. Some more tools that are helpful. Cropping is useful if you're cropping an image. I know that mine right now is set to 11 by 17, but if I wanted to sort of change the dimensions of an image, you can grow or shrink. I'm going to hit escape, but you hit the crop button, these little marks come up, and I can click and drag and make, a different size canvas if I would like. Eyedropper is useful for selecting colors. So like if I wanted to match a color in an image, like if I wanted to be able to paint with this blue that I used previously, I could use the eyedropper and then go to the paintbrush tool, which is here. And then if I have a layer selected that's turned on, I could then paint with that same color. So that's useful. I don't really use the pencil or these other brushes. I primarily am using the brush. Up here at the top, notice as I'm clicking through different tools, like this window or this bar up here does change. So look at that as you're selecting different tools to see what options that you can choose from for certain techniques, or tools rather. Up here, when I have the brush tool selected, I can select the kind of brush. So there's many options. You might need to load them if they're not showing up automatically. But basically you can pick brushes. If I hit the bracket, I can make my brush bigger or smaller. This goes for any of them, square or otherwise. To load a brush, I believe you click this little wheel or up at the top and then hit load brushes, and it should bring you to a place to load brushes. You can create your own brushes. We won't get in that today. You can download brushes from the internet. I've downloaded some of these, which could be useful in some modes of using Photoshop. I think, trying to look. Okay. So next, we'll talk about the clone stamp in a minute, but this is a tool that allows you to like clone something in paint with it. The paint bucket works similarly to using K in Illustrator, where if you have a paint bucket, it will fill in anything solid. So if I make a layer, I can fill that whole layer in solid. If I want to select, I can also, I'm just gonna turn everything else off. I can also like draw a shape and then take the paint bucket and fill in shapes. I can draw a shape with my lasso and then hit the paint bucket. When you click and hold, you can see like the other options that you get for a tool, but then you can also see the letter command if you like to use keyboard shortcuts. So like for example, if I'm using the lasso tool and I'm drawing and I don't want to have to go over and click the paint bucket again, I can hit G, which is the command for paint bucket, and then I can paint. So that's kind of useful. I don't really use these too much. I don't really use text very often in Photoshop. Normally I'm creating images that are not vector line work. Always when I'm using Photoshop, that's what I'm doing. And so text doesn't work as well, in my opinion, with pixelated images or with raster images. Raster images means that if I zoom all the way in, you can see that this image, this blue square rectangle that I drew earlier, is actually made up of a bunch of tiny little pixels that are filled in certain colors. And when you're working with vectors, which is what we did when we were using Adobe Illustrator, that's actually a series of lines that connect different points in space. And so the image here is really a raster image that's not going to be manipulated in the same way or as easily necessarily as you would manipulate a vector image with line work. You can also, draw different shapes. This is the selection tool, which is what I've been using. Pan, which is useful. And zooming. I often don't use the zoom. If I can hold the Option key and use the scroll bar on my scroll wheel on my mouse to zoom. Here's where you can select colors to draw with or paint with, etc. So that's kind of the quick rundown. There's some more tools over here which we'll get into as we move through. Maybe I'll just quickly blow through them. So again, like text, not necessarily something you're using, but you can use it. Like works similarly to Illustrator, both the characters and the paragraphs. Color is the color picker, so you can kind of move, like select colors. This way you can set specific presets if you know your RGB values. You can change to different types of color sliders here. I'm just going to stick with RGB. Swatches, you can, if you have colors that you want to set or use that you like, that you either find from inspiration or just you want to kind of make up your own palette, you can. To make a color, a swatch that you can use it later, you select the color. If you have an image that you're eyedropping from, you could eyedrop it with the eyedropper tool, and then you hit the new little square to make a swatch. You can name it, or normally I just don't name them, but you can name them whatever you want and hit OK. And then it'll make that color so you can easily refer to it again if you need it. Let's see. other things that are important. I think the layer panel is really the other one that I use primarily on this side. Not that these aren't important, we just won't go over them today. So that's the basic tools and setup. So now to talk about just like how to edit images that you find or how to start to create collage elements. So one of the first things that you'll want to be able to do is like figure out how to cut out different shapes or different buildings or different interior spaces from images. One way to do this is to take the lasso tool and zoom in and trace around the outside of something. If I hold shift, it keeps my line perpendicular, but in this case, this is a little crooked, so that's not going to help. But so you can click, around it and trace the image, which is a good way of doing it. Do it more neatly than I'm going to do it now. But so that's one way of cutting out an image, trace around the whole thing. Again, the lasso tool likes to be, again, the more you zoom in, the better your tracing will be. I'm just doing this quickly so you don't have to watch too long. So trace around the image, and again, the lasso tool likes to be completely solid, so you have to create closed shapes. So notice as I'm about to finish tracing, that little circle appears at the bottom of my lasso tool, which shows me that I'm closing the shape. So now I've traced around that image. I'm going to just hit Command C, which is copy. I'm going to make a new layer, and then I'm going to hit Command V. Oops, something weird a second. Command C. Oh, sorry. Make sure you have the layer selected that you want to copy from. Command C, and then my new layer, layer 2. Hit Command V, and then I'm going to turn the background off so you can see it. So again, make sure you have the layer you're copying from selected while you're selecting. You can tell something's selected again when it's blue. So that's one way of copying that. This tool, the Quick Select tool, is useful sometimes if you have images and you don't want to trace. If I click and sort of hold and move my mouse around, notice that it just quickly selected anything that was sort of in that dark gray tone because it stands out in contrast with background. If you're working with things that are really close in color, it might not work, but it is useful for certain things. To add to it, I can just keep clicking on the white. To make my selection tool bigger or smaller, I can hit the brackets. If I accidentally select something that I'm not supposed to, like maybe that, I can deselect by holding Option or Alt, and then click, and it starts to erase. I can also use the lasso tool with the quick select. So if I hold Alt, I can subtract. If I say I missed, although I want that back. And if I hold Shift, I can add to a selection. So if I click Shift and hold Shift as I'm cutting out, I can add to a selection. I'm going to deselect that because I don't want it. But so similar process, once you've added enough using a combination of the quick select and maybe the lasso tool, you can copy again. Let's say that's good enough. Command C, new layer, Command V, and then you'll have your building cut out. So that's pretty useful. Another thing that is useful to think about is kind of what is known as a mask. So sometimes you don't necessarily want to cut something out or delete the rest of the image. So normally I duplicate an image so it stays in the Photoshop file. The other thing you could do is leave the image all in there and create a mask to hide the surrounding image that you don't want. So I'm just going to use Quick Select really quickly. And then I'm going to hit this button down here that is the Add Mayor Mask button. And so what that did is anything that I hadn't selected, it just hid it. So I'm going to disable this for a second. So you can see my image is all still there. If I right click and I hit Enable, it turns the mask back on. And so what's neat about that is, say I wanted to add, I missed those little antenna at the top of the building. So I can unmask by painting, it's a little confusing, but I can unmask something by painting white. So if I use a different brush, go back to my circle brush. But so if I, let's see, I can paint, the brush is really big now, make it smaller by hitting the bracket. If I paint white on the mask itself, I know that I'm using the mask when I have these little corners selected, they're like white. If I paint, I can bring back the image behind it. So remember there's like blue sky back there. So if I cover it back over, again, selecting on the mask only, not on the image. If I cover back over it with black, I mask things away again. So masks are useful if you want to like sort of use some of an image and edit an image without deleting the whole image itself. So could be useful. Again, if you're coloring with white, it brings the image back. If you're coloring with white, it brings the image back. If I can do this correctly. And if you're coloring with the dark color, it masks the image. So those are masks. Again, the mask button is this little rectangle with the black hole in it down at the bottom. So masks, polygonal lasso tool, creating new layers. We'll come back to this and see what's next. This one, I think I was just going to show a similar thing, just the idea that you can cut out a building. But maybe what I'll do here is I'll show you how to edit kind of an image. So if I have my background layer, I'm going to unlock it. So when you download images from the internet and you open them, normally they open in Photoshop as locked. What I can do to this is say I maybe don't like the colors in this image and I want to go for a look that's more monochromatic, let's say, and so I want to adjust sort of the color of this image. I could do that a couple ways. So if I have the layer selected, I can click the little circle thing down at the bottom and make a new layer. So maybe I'll change the hue saturation. Remember, hue is the colors, like means color. So like I can edit the hue of the image, maybe to bring it to something that's like a little bit less real. Maybe that green and purple is kind of interesting. And then maybe I'll desaturate a little bit too. Maybe I like this like black and white-ish and purple-green look. I don't know if that's the best option, but you can edit images that way. And what that does is it actually creates a layer that is the hue saturation layer. So you can turn it on and off if you like it. It affects anything that's below it on the layer list. So if I had other layers, it would affect those as well. If you right-click, you can merge layers, and then that will take that hue saturation and make it permanent on your actual image. Again, I can turn this on and off. And what's nice about this is you can go back and adjust things later. So if I click that part, it opens that hue panel again. So maybe I decide later I'm going to go more pink and green. You can adjust that as you start to add things. So that's that. You can also, if you don't want the flexibility of adjusting things by a layer, you can just edit an image by having the layer selected, go Image, Adjustments, and then open Hue Saturation here, or black and white, or some of these other options. If you do that, so I'll just do it, Hue Saturation, let's see, I'm going to desaturate this. I'm going to really saturate it, just to be extreme. Hit OK. Now that's permanent. So now that image has been edited and you can't undo it. So if you are certain and that you're not going to change it later, you can do things that way. You can change, if you go back to Image, Adjustments, you can adjust other things. You can make the image black and white this way, hit OK. I'm going to hit Undo. You can also do that down here through a layer. So if I wanted to do, open my layer panel back up. Again, the layers are these little overlapping rectangular shapes. Let's see if I click this. I can do black and white down here, and then it opens this black and white where I can start to edit the sliders. When I'm editing the yellows and greens and blues, it's making them darker or lighter depending on how I'm sliding. So it's not necessarily making it more yellow, it's just accentuating the yellows either in a light direction or dark direction. Same thing with the greens and blues. So you can play around with that. But what's nice about that is that it's also a layer, so you can turn it on and off if you decide to. do something different later. Okay, let's see. This one, I was going to show you how to edit a perspective of something that already exists. So I cut this building out just using the quick select tool really quickly. You could cut it out with more precisely using a lasso tool, so just notice the edges are a little rough. Just note that the more careful you are cutting things out, probably the better the quality of the image will be, but just in the nature of time, I just did it really quickly and roughly. So this is the Beinecke Rare Books Library. If you're curious, it's a really cool library, look it up. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to edit a perspective. So I have a layer with my building on it selected, and I'm going to go to Edit at the top, and I'm going to do Perspective Warp. And so it kind of gives you hints on how to do this. It's asking me to define the perspective angle that I want to edit. So first you click and it gives you this rectangle. I'm just going to drag these little pins to the corners of this sort of face of the building. You could do this on the interior or exterior. And then I'm going to draw my other side by clicking and dragging. And I'm going to drag it over till that line turns blue. And it's automatically going to snap those 2 points for me, which is nice. And then I'm going to drag this one up. And I'm going to drag this one down a little bit just so they line up. Again, you can do this as neatly as you want. I'm just doing it quickly. And then from there, you hit enter. And then now you can move the points to change the perspective of the building. So maybe, maybe your vanishing points are somewhere way over here and you want to elongate the building. Maybe the vanishing points over here are slightly different. So and notice that it is kind of changing the perspective in a pretty nice way. There's like points at which, right, where things start to get really wonky, which maybe isn't that weird, right? Maybe weird is good in this case. So, but that's how you could edit or manipulate perspectives to kind of get things to match up or work a little bit better together. When you're adding textures, it's really useful to think about manipulating textures. The perspective warp. So again, edit perspective warp. Let's see. This one. So this is a scale figure I downloaded from the internet. Mr. Cutout. MrCutout.com is a nice website for cutouts, I think. So you could use that if you're looking for sort of scale figures or other elements to put in your building. Or interior collages. But I want to show you how to manipulate this person a little bit. This person is kind of black, white, and gray, which is actually kind of nice, but if I wanted to change it up a little bit, I could sort of make this person more teal. So to do that, I could do a new layer and do hue saturation. And that's where I could use my sliders to change the hue. And notice, like, as I'm making her a different color or sliding, she's changing color. I can desaturate or desaturate, make it more grayscale. Can make it really vibrant. I tend to like lean toward less intense, bright colors and more muted palettes in my own work. I think bright colors can be useful. You just need to be careful with how you use them. So sliding, you can see, like, you can make things super light, very dark. It's not making it transparent, it's just changing how dark or light it is. So that's a way to change the color of any image, not just a scale figure, right? You could do this for buildings, you could do this for spaces, you could do this for materials, textures. I'm just showing how you edit people. Normally you don't want your people to look sort of out of place from the rest of the image, so getting something that kind of fits within the graphics is important. Another way to do scale figures is what's called through a silhouette. Think about it as like the figure ground. So if I have my umbrella person, I'm just going to duplicate this layer by clicking, dragging, holding it down, and dropping it on the new layer button. Now I have umbrella person 2. But to make it a silhouette, you can double click and there's all these different options for things that you can do to a layer. They're called styles. I'm going to just do what's called a color overlay, and I'm going to make it fully opaque for this, just to make it the full silhouette. And if I double click the color, I can pick kind of any color I want, or I could eyedrop a swatch if I have a swatch that I like. Maybe I want her to be this bright orange, or maybe there's like this muted sort of color in my drawing that I want to use. I hit OK. If you want, you can show sort of some of the texture or detail through it by adjusting the opacity, or think of it as transparency, opacity, transparency, by adjusting the opacity of that color overlay. So maybe I want to see some of the detail, but I don't want all of it. And you can play around with the colors. Maybe I want something, a little more gray. Hit OK, and hit OK. And then now my scale figure has sort of this color on it. You can turn that on and off by clicking the little eyeball. You can turn all the effects of a layer on and off by clicking that eyeball. So if I double click to rename something, you double click on the text. To open the effects panel, you double click off the text, if that makes sense. You can play around with some of these other things too. Like, I don't typically use a lot of them, but some of them are kind of fun and useful to explore as well. So you can have, all that is to say that you can have multiple effects on a layer at one time. Let's see. The other thing you might consider doing is just making high contrast black and white scale figures. That's kind of a nice look that you can do. So to do that, I'm just going to duplicate my umbrella person again to show you. And then with the layer selected, I'm going to go to Image, Adjustments. I'm going to turn it black and white first. Hit OK. Use the Select tool and move her over so we can see. And then I'm going to go Image, Adjustments, and then I'm going to do, brightness contrast. I think if I turn up the brightness and I turn up the contrast, notice that as I slide the contrast up, the whites become more white and the black becomes more black. As I turn the brightness up, everything gets a little brighter. Hit OK. Maybe a high contrast black and white image could be useful too. Again, you could double click and do some sort of color overlay on top of that, and adjust the opacity. So maybe that starts to be an interesting scale figure for a collage. So that is scale figure editing. Obviously, you can manipulate images like buildings, backgrounds, sites, landscapes, interior spaces, textures, materials, the same way, right? All of that applies. I just happened to do it on top of a scale figure so you could see. Let's see. This one, scaling an image. This is what this one was for. So sometimes you'll find images from the internet that don't, almost all the time, that don't fit your canvas size. So if I go Image, Canvas size, this is just telling me how big, we said it earlier when we made a new file, this is just telling me how big the actual canvas or the paper will be when I print. You can change it here if you didn't set it correctly the first time, just double checking 11 by 17. And if I go image size, this is where it tells you like how big sort of the image is that you found or opened. And our other file that we set as 11 by 17, we use 300 pixels per inch. This one I've downloaded from the internet is not that high. It might be okay because it's big enough, but just know that if you're downloading images from the internet that are too small, sometimes you have images with issues with pixels. So you just want to make sure, like if I were to duplicate this layer to my other file, it might look a little pixelated, so just double check that. You should be okay as long as something's not like really small on the screen and also a low pixel count. So I'm just going to go image size. I'm just going to set that to 300 just so we have it. Notice that things zooms me in. If I zoom all the way in, I can see all those little pixels. I didn't actually change the image itself. It was what it was when I opened it, but I just changed my drawing so that everything else I do won't be a low pixel. So to move this thing around, I've been using this like selection tool, or move tool is what it's called, up at the top. So when you have a layer selected, again, you might need to unlock something when you open it. But when you have that selected and you're using the move tool, you can literally click and move it around. You can also hit Command T, and that'll allow you to change the scale of it. If I hold Shift and click on one of these arrows, click and hold. So I'm holding Shift and I'm clicking with my mouse and holding it down and moving it to sort of scale that image. So I'm just going to keep doing that, and I'm going to get it so that it fits full bleed. So that's how you would scale something. Maybe this is sort of the start of a nice background that I could use for my collage. Maybe I just want part of it. Maybe I want the whole thing. Let's see. What's the next one? Sometimes it's helpful to select things using a color range. So if I go to select, first you have to have the layer that you're working with selected. So if I go select color range, and then I turn the fuzziness, normally I turn the fuzziness up to like middle area, 90 something is fine. I'm going to hit the select tool with the plus sign, and I'm just going to click a couple places. And what it's doing, if I click in the green, maybe it'll show you. It's like selecting any of the colors that I've hit. So I'm gonna, let's see, I'm gonna hit cancel and do that again. So select, up at the top, hit select color range, and then I'm gonna click and start selecting. Right now I'm just selecting one color. So notice as I click the green, it's selecting anything that's green. I'm gonna hit the plus sign, and I'm gonna just select all of the different greens in here. And then I'm going to hit the minus sign and kind of get some of those blues out. Maybe do the plus sign again. And then notice as I'm selecting things, this is what's changing. I'm going to hit OK. And then so now it's made a selection of all of those green bits. And I can hit Command C, and I can put it on its own layer. Let me turn this off. Oh, it selected the blue, sorry. Selected the blue, that's fine, that works too. In some cases, it's just useful to be able to select different colors, because then you can either delete them, although I would have preferred probably to delete the sky and keep the green, or you can sort of, if I do that again, select color range, and I hit the green. Okay. You can do something that works nicely too, is you can edit that. You can edit the hue saturation of that on its own. And maybe like, you don't want to change the green necessarily, but I have like a hue saturation layer where maybe you're editing the hue saturation to not be quite so blue or to not be quite so green, and you just want something that looks a little bit more yellow. So that could be one way of dealing with editing some color out of an image. Let's see. Oh, I was going to use this one to show how you can edit the sort of movement of a scale figure, or you can edit the shape of a building or space. So if I go to Edit Puppet Warp, and I'm going to give it a couple points. I'm going to click 1, 2, 2, maybe 2, 3, and then I'm going to click and hold this last one. It'll actually edit, stretch, or puppet warp your piece. So I can click and drag maybe this girl riding a horse that I got from MrCutout.com actually wants to be actually riding a horse, right? So that's a fun example of that. You can also use the puppet warp on buildings to get things to curve. So if you have a layer selected, I can go Edit, Puppet Warp, and I'm going to give it a couple points. Maybe I'll do just the top. So 1, 2, 3, and then again, you can do more than 3 if you want, 4, say. You can start to push and pull things, so if you wanted to make it seem like this building was curving, thinking to one of the last examples from the lecture where the building was curving, I think you could start to manipulate or warp things, so that they look like they're bending. So there's that one, again, back to the straight one. So it's kind of a fun technique. So again, that's under, up at the top, edit, puppet, warp. Let's see if there's anything else I was going to cover. Oh, this is a useful one. So trees are notoriously a hard thing to cut out when you're downloading things. You can find trees a lot of times on the internet nowadays. But you can also make your own trees. So if you go to Filter, Render, there's different options. Flame is a weird one, but Tree. And it opens this window, and you can literally go through and tell it, like type of tree. Maybe I want to do a willow tree. You can tell it like where the light's coming from. You can tell it how many leaves you want, down to like not many leaves. You can tell it how big the leaves are. So basically you can just design your own trees and create, trees for your renderings. I'm just going to hit OK. And so now I have this tree that I've made. You can edit trees by you can make them all one color if you wanted to, right? So you could make this tree like slightly more purple by doing a color overlay that has a lower opacity. So I think just knowing that you can make your own trees is helpful, especially if you're trying to do something in the foreground. You could scale it up, kind of move it so that it's like entering the foreground, right? And your image is beyond back here. You can, again, Command T, can edit, hit Enter to accept the edit. So again, filter, if you have a layer selected, make a filter, render tree, and then make lots of different trees. So notice how this one looks pretty fake. Like sometimes they look pretty fake, and that's when I would say doing something to them, or maybe just using fewer leaves. But now that starts to even look a little bit better, right? So I think editing them is always smart after you've made them. Playing around with some of the filters. If you do multiply, maybe there's something nice about trees overlapping or buildings overlapping. It starts to convey depth. So it's always a good rule of thumb to not just make the tree or not just find the image on the internet, but you want to manipulate it to have the color work and match with you, with the rest of your images. So I think that is all I have for you all today in Photoshop. Please feel free to reach out to your graduate assistants for some more tips and tricks in Photoshop, and good luck editing. Thank you.